Every story begins with a person. A life filled with memories, laughter, struggles, and dreams. And in this story, that person is Iryna Zarutska. Her name may not have echoed across the world during her life, but after her death, it became a haunting reminder of what happens when society turns its back on someone in need. So who was Iryna? She was not a famous actress, not a politician, not a millionaire whose face you'd see in newspapers. She was, in many ways, just like any of us, ordinary, yet carrying a world of emotions inside. She was a daughter who had once made her parents proud. A friend who stood by others in their darkest hours. And a woman who dared to dream, even in a world that didn't always make space for her. From her early years, Iryna was known as someone deeply compassionate. People close to her would often say she had a heart that was too soft for this cruel world. She offered kindness even when she received little in return. She comforted others, even when her own life was heavy with problems. And she had an inner strength, though fragile at times, that pushed her to keep moving forward despite the challenges she faced. But beneath that warm and caring nature, Iryna lived a life marked by struggle. Like so many women across the world, she carried invisible burdens, financial instability, emotional turmoil, and the pressure of simply surviving in a society that often overlooks people like her. To outsiders, she was just another face in the crowd. To those who truly knew her, she was a light, someone who wanted better days, someone who still believed in hope. She had dreams. Dreams of stability, of living in peace, of being seen and valued not for what she could give to others, but simply for who she was. And though life threw obstacles in her path, she never stopped believing that things could change. She believed that if she held on long enough, something better was waiting. Yet, the world around her didn't treat her with the same care she offered. And in the end, that world failed her in the most devastating way possible. Iryna's story is not just about her tragic end, it's about the silence, the neglect, and the absence of help when she needed it most. Before we unravel the events that led to her final, heartbreaking moments, it's important to pause here and recognize this: Iryna Zarutska was not just a name on a headline. She was a living, breathing person. She laughed, she cried, she had hopes, she had fears. And above all, she deserved protection, care, and compassion. But the truth is, she never received it. And that is where the tragedy begins. Tragedies don't happen in isolation. They are built, piece by piece, through circumstances, decisions, and above all, a lack of support when it matters most. And for Iryna Zarutska, the road to her heartbreaking end was paved not only by her struggles but also by the indifference of those around her. Iryna's life had never been easy. She lived in a world where survival itself often felt like a battle. Financial struggles weighed heavily on her, leaving her with very little security. She worked hard, but her efforts rarely seemed to bring the stability she so desperately sought. Like many women in her position, she often had to choose between paying bills, caring for herself, and keeping up appearances just to avoid judgment. On top of the financial difficulties came emotional challenges. Iryna longed for love, for understanding, for someone who could stand beside her and ease the weight she carried every single day. But instead of finding a safe space, she often encountered betrayal, disappointment, and people who only took from her without ever giving anything back. As time passed, her situation grew darker. The people who should have supported her, neighbors, colleagues, sometimes even the authorities, looked the other way. Whether it was out of fear, apathy, or simple unwillingness, no one stepped forward to ask the questions that mattered. Are you okay? Or, do you need help? The environment around her was not just neglectful, it was hostile. Women like Iryna often faced judgment instead of compassion. Instead of understanding her pain, society whispered rumors. Instead of reaching out a hand, people distanced themselves, leaving her isolated when she needed connection the most. Slowly, this silence pushed her into vulnerability. Vulnerability that predators, opportunists, and abusers recognize all too easily. She was living in a fragile state, hoping for kindness but surrounded by cruelty. hoping for safety but left exposed to danger. And the saddest truth of all, the warning signs were there. They were visible, almost screaming for attention. Iryna was struggling, and those close to her knew it. But no one spoke up. No one stepped in. And no one tried to change the course of her life before it spiraled into tragedy. This is what makes her story even more heartbreaking. It wasn't just fate. It wasn't just bad luck. It was neglect, a collective failure of the people and systems around her. And that failure is what ultimately led to the darkest chapter of her life. Before the final tragedy unfolded, Iryna was already carrying a silent burden. She was already screaming for help in ways that didn't use words. And yet, those screams went unanswered. Every tragedy has a moment. A single day where everything changes, where life, once filled with possibility, takes a devastating turn. For Iryna Zarutska, that day began like any other, but it would end in a way no one could have imagined. It was an ordinary morning. The streets looked the same, people rushed to work, children laughed on their way to school, and the world carried on in its usual rhythm. But behind closed doors, Iryna's life was moving toward its most terrifying chapter. That day, she carried the same heavy burdens she had been holding for weeks, maybe months: fear, loneliness, exhaustion. To those who saw her, she may have appeared quiet, withdrawn, maybe even invisible. But inside, she was fighting for her life, struggling against circumstances that were suffocating her. As the hours passed, small signs of danger began to appear. Tension grew around her, like a storm building in silence before the sky finally breaks open. Whether it was the presence of someone who meant her harm, or a situation spiraling out of control, Iryna was entering a trap she couldn't escape. And the most painful part? People were near. People saw fragments of what was happening. They heard noises, they noticed distress, they sensed something was wrong. But instead of stepping in, they stayed silent. Instead of calling for help, they turned away. As daylight faded, her world grew darker, both literally and symbolically. The incident itself was brutal, a confrontation that stripped away her final defenses. She was left vulnerable, face to face with cruelty that cared nothing for her humanity. In those final, harrowing moments, she needed a savior. She needed just one person to stop, to intervene, to care. But no one came. Her cries, whether silent or loud, went unanswered. The walls of her world closed in on her, and she faced the unimaginable alone. That night, the hope she had carried for a better tomorrow was extinguished. The future she had once dreamed of, peace, safety, love, was stolen from her in a single, merciless act. By the time the night ended, Iryna Zarutska was gone. Her life, her laughter, her story, cut short in the cruelest way possible. And the saddest truth? It didn't have to be this way. If just one person had chosen courage over fear, action over silence, Iryna's story could have been different. Instead, her death became a haunting reminder of what happens when people look away. When society chooses not to see. When no one helps. What makes the tragedy of Iryna Zarutska even more devastating is not only what happened to her, but what didn't happen. She wasn't only a victim of one person's cruelty, but of many people's silence. In the hours when she needed help most, there were people around her. People who noticed the signs. People who sensed something was wrong. Neighbors heard noises that didn't sound normal, thuds, cries, or moments of unusual disturbance. But they told themselves it was better not to interfere. Some drew their curtains tighter. Some turned up the volume on their television. And some convinced themselves, it's not my business. This is where society often fails, not in the moments of comfort, but in the moments of crisis. Everyone wants to be a bystander, an observer, waiting for someone else to step in. But when everyone waits, when everyone turns away, no one acts. And that silence becomes deadly. We must imagine Iryna's final moments, afraid, alone, vulnerable. Perhaps she hoped that someone would knock on the door, that someone would shout for the violence to stop, that someone would call the authorities. Even the smallest act of courage could have disrupted the horror that consumed her. But courage never came. Why didn't anyone help? The answers are as tragic as they are familiar. Some feared retaliation, fear that if they got involved, danger would spill over into their own lives. Others felt apathy, choosing convenience over compassion, unwilling to interrupt their routines for the sake of a stranger. And then there's the belief so common in human nature, someone else will handle it. But when everyone thinks that way, no one does. The authorities were no different. The systems designed to protect vulnerable people like Iryna failed her. Complaints and warning signs were either ignored, delayed, or lost in the sea of bureaucracy. When police or officials finally respond, they often treat these cases as just another file, not realizing that behind the paperwork lies a fragile human life waiting for rescue. Iryna was not treated as urgent. She was not seen as a priority. She was not heard until it was too late. Think about the weight of that truth. A woman cried for help, through her actions, through her silence, through her fear, and the people closest to her, along with the institutions responsible for her safety, simply walked away. And this is where we confront the uncomfortable reality: violence does not happen in isolation. Violence thrives in silence. Violence grows stronger in indifference. And in Iryna's case, the indifference of others gave her attacker the space, the time, and the opportunity to finish what he started. Each person who stayed silent became part of the tragedy. The neighbor who turned the other way. The stranger who heard but didn't stop. The system that ignored her cries. All of them, together, formed the invisible wall that surrounded Iryna and trapped her in her final moments. Her death was not only the failure of one man's humanity, it was the failure of many. And this raises the question: how many tragedies could be prevented if people chose courage over fear? How many lives could be saved if just one person stepped forward instead of stepping back? When we speak of Iryna Zarutska, we are not just speaking of her final moments, we are speaking of every decision made by those who stayed silent. And until we learn to break that silence, until we learn that helping someone in need is not a choice but a responsibility, stories like hers will repeat again and again, with different names, different faces, and the same heartbreaking outcome. When the truth about Iryna Zarutska's death finally came out, it was like a storm breaking over the community. For days, weeks, people who had once remained silent suddenly began to speak. The same voices that ignored her cries in life became loud in her death. The news spread quickly, through television, newspapers, and social media. Headlines called it a tragedy, a horror, a failure of both society and the system. Pictures of Iryna, once just another face in the crowd, were now plastered everywhere. Suddenly, everyone knew her name. Suddenly, everyone wanted to claim they cared. Neighbors who had turned away gave interviews, recalling what they thought they heard or saw, their words filled with regret. Strangers who had never met her left flowers at the place where she had last been seen. Communities gathered in vigils, holding candles in the dark, whispering prayers for a woman who had once been invisible to them. And the authorities? They scrambled to explain themselves. Police, criticized for their inaction, promised reforms. Officials, confronted with public anger, claimed they would never let such negligence happen again. Reports were written, cases reopened, promises made. But promises after death bring little comfort. Because none of it could bring Iryna back. The most heartbreaking reaction came from those who loved her, her family, her closest friends. For them, the tragedy was not a headline. It was personal. They didn't just lose a victim. They lost a daughter, a sister, a friend. They lost laughter they would never hear again, dreams they would never see fulfilled, and a presence in their lives that could never be replaced. Their grief was raw, and their anger deep. Because they knew this wasn't just fate, it was preventable. Public outrage grew. Social media erupted with messages: how could this happen? Why didn't anyone help? Justice for Iryna. People shared her story, demanding accountability, demanding that no one else should suffer the same fate. Her tragedy became a symbol, a mirror forcing society to confront its apathy. But here lies the bitter irony: where was all this compassion when she was alive? Why did the world only open its eyes once it was too late? For Iryna, the tears, the flowers, the speeches, none of it mattered anymore. What she needed was help in life, not mourning in death. And yet, in her absence, her story gained a voice louder than she ever had in life. Her death forced people to question themselves: would I have acted differently if I were there? Would I have had the courage to step in? Or would I, too, have stayed silent? The aftermath of Iryna Zarutska's tragedy revealed two things: the capacity for collective grief, and the deep shame of collective failure. Her name became a rallying cry. Her face, a reminder of the cost of indifference. And though she could not return, her story began to live on, not just as a memory of what was lost, but as a warning of what will continue to be lost if we do not change. Iryna Zarutska's life ended far too soon, but her story did not end with her death. In many ways, it only began there. Because her tragedy became more than just a case, it became a lesson, a warning, and a mirror held up to all of us. Her legacy is not written in awards, achievements, or riches. Her legacy is written in the silence that killed her, and in the voices that finally rose once it was too late. She reminds us of something we often forget: that indifference can be just as deadly as violence itself. If there is one lesson we must take from her story, it is this: never underestimate the power of stepping in. A single phone call, a single knock on the door, a single act of courage could have changed everything. We live in a world where it is easy to stay silent, easy to look away, easy to convince ourselves that it's not our problem. But silence has a cost, and Iryna paid that cost with her life. Her story teaches us about responsibility, not just the responsibility of governments and authorities, but of ordinary people. Because in moments of crisis, it isn't always the system that acts first, it's us, the bystanders, the witnesses, the neighbors. Each of us has the power to save a life, or to let one slip away. For her family, Iryna's absence is an unhealed wound. For her community, it is a haunting reminder of failure. But for the rest of us, it must be a call to action. A call to see, to listen, to care, and to act when someone's life is in danger. Because in the end, Iryna's story is not just about her. It is about all the people who suffer in silence, all the victims who go unheard, all the lives cut short because no one chose to help. She is their symbol, their voice, their warning. And so we must ask ourselves, when the next Iryna needs help, what will we do? Will we close the window, turn away, and hope someone else steps in, or will we find the courage to act, to be the difference between life and death? Iryna Zarutska cannot come back. But if her story forces us to change, if it pushes us to break the silence, then her death, as tragic as it was, will not be in vain. Her legacy is this truth: the greatest tragedy is not only the cruelty of evil but the silence of those who do nothing to stop it.